Hi, this is Jim from Trek World, and we invite you to join us today as we take a look back at Star Trek, the animated series. Now, this animated series predates Star Trek Lower Decks by about 50 years, and amazingly, a lot of the general public don't even know it existed. So join us after the break as we see all of that change as we enter into the 21st century. Please be sure to check out these other popular videos about Season 1 in our series covering Star Trek in the 1960s. And also, please be sure to hit that like button below the video so that YouTube will recommend this video to other folks who have not yet discovered it. Lastly, please consider becoming a VIP supporter via our Patreon site using the link below in the description. The year is 1969, and NBC has just issued the second and final cancellation of a TV series named Star Trek. Now, this series had been canceled the year before as well, and a massive letter writing campaign changed NBC's mind, and they brought it back for a third season, but it didn't last far beyond that. For many years afterwards, it was commonly believed that the only reason this cancellation occurred was because of continual poor ratings by the series. But as the years would pass, it became much more widely understood that it was more directly a result of a souring relationship between Gene Roddenberry and the network. Now, shortly after the cancellation, Herb Solow, an executive producer for Paramount, immediately began offering the series in syndication throughout the country. As the years passed slowly by, Star Trek then began showing up in almost every major market daily, and its popularity skyrocketed. In short, Star Trek was now far more valuable to advertisers in syndication than it had ever been while it was in production. At the height of its popularity, it was airing in the United States at, get this, 308 times a week in 134 United States stations. And later, it would then be translated into 47 different languages and sold in syndication internationally to 131 international markets. One thing was certain: no one could ever use ratings as an excuse for NBC's failure. Though it became obvious to the network and to the production officials alike at Paramount that there was still money to make in Star Trek. But how to pursue it without getting back in bed with Roddenberry? The answer came from Filmation, an animation powerhouse in television that had been making children's programming since 1960. When the famous letter writing campaign that saved Star Trek after its second season went public, it caught Filmation's attention, and they approached Paramount while Star Trek was still on the air. They wanted to do a Saturday morning cartoon show based on the series. The idea would be that this series would be about young people in training on a ship named the Excalibur. Now, ironically, this Starfleet Academy kind of approach would show up again and again throughout history, but would never really be completely realized in this vision. Though Mason tried unsuccessfully to get the deal together with Paramount and Roddenberry, it simply wasn't going to be. The relationship between Paramount and Roddenberry was so severely strained, and NBC wanted no part of another show by Roddenberry. But Star Trek's syndication performance changed all of that. And now, Paramount and NBC were 100% behind going forward with the cartoon series because, from their perspective, it would give them a revenue stream without actually having to deal with Gene Roddenberry. Since the animation would be done by Filmation, as far as NBC and Paramount were concerned, this was free money to them. But Roddenberry was not an idiot. He knew he had a lot of leverage going into this negotiation, and negotiate he did. By the time he was done, he had a full guaranteed 2 seasons, 22 episodes, full creative control, and a budget of, get this, $75,000 an episode, which at that time was the highest anyone had ever spent on a single episode of animation to date. He also won the concession that he would only do Star Trek and not Kiddie Trek, hence the creative control. So the whole Starfleet Academy would sort of like go away. Well, maybe not completely. The concept would end up on a Filmation live-action show later entitled Space Academy. In one of life's great ironies, On September 8th, 1973, exactly 7 years to the day that Star Trek premiered on NBC, Star Trek was back on the air. Today, this is widely referred to as Star Trek the Animated Series, but back then, it was simply Star Trek. Roddenberry was adamant that the show was Star Trek. It was not a kiddie show. It was a continuation of the original series, which is why he used the same title. The addition of the animated series to the title was not done until many years later. The series, which lasted 2 years, could be viewed as the completion of the Enterprise's 5-year mission. DC Fontana personally viewed the 22 episodes as being year 4. StarTrek.com today refers to both seasons as year 4 and year 5. Almost immediately, it sold into 25 major markets and was branded a success from day one. Okay, we really need to talk about two people before we go much further into Star Trek the Animated Series. The first is Dorothy C. Fontana. Now, Dorothy Fontana met Gene Roddenberry in 1961 when she was filling in for his secretary while working on the TV series The Lieutenant. Roddenberry encouraged her writing, and she soon adopted the name of D.C. Fontana because no one could tell if that was a woman or a man that wrote it by the name alone. And let's face it, if you thought it was bad today, ladies and gentlemen in Hollywood, it was murder back then. She worked as a story editor for him on the original Star Trek series, but when the animated series came up, he gave her a job as associate producer. She basically was responsible for all things creative, the scripts, the angles, the stories, things of that nature. The relationship between her and Gene continued several decades until she parted ways with Roddenberry during her tenure with Star Trek The Next Generation. Now, one of the other great mysteries of Star Trek is, what happened to the theme music in the cartoon? There's nothing from Star Trek in that theme music. Well, the idea was this. Filmation always 100% wrote their own music for all of their cartoons. It didn't matter if the cartoon was a previously existing IP. They would write the music because they did not want to pay the royalties to be able to air the music. Now, that might seem a little bit trivial to you at front, but those royalties add up. Remember, Gene Roddenberry famously put words to the theme to Star Trek so that he could keep half of the royalties every time it was used. So it was a pretty big thing. However, the Star Trek theme for the animated series was actually written by the legendary jazz musician Ray Ellis. But because of his contracts, he could not do this kind of work, so he would use a pen name. So he created Yvette Blaze as his pen name, and he also gave co-credit to another person who, interestingly enough, was created by using the two names of his two children, Jeff and Michael. Now, as we watch the portraits show you what the cast is going to look like in the TV series, let's talk a little bit about that cast. We obviously expected we were going to get William Shatner back, and Leonard Nimoy, and DeForest Kelley, Jimmy Doohan, Majel Barrett, but the original idea was not to bring George Takei as Sulu, Walter Koenig as Chekhov, or Nichelle Nichols back as Uhura, even though they had the largest weekly budget ever for a TV cartoon. They claimed they didn't have enough money to bring in the entire cast. Well, that sounded plausible, but then again, as time has gone by, it seems more and more dubious as the days go on. So when they got everybody together for the very first time for a table read, Leonard looked around and said, well, where is everybody? And then it was explained to him that the budget had precluded them from being included in the cast. He very calmly told them, no George, no Leonard, no Nichelle, no Leonard. To this day, we don't really understand why he didn't stick up for Walter the same way. There probably was a reason, but I will tell you this. Walter did say in an interview in 2018 that he had been upset about being excluded from the series. So Walter definitely felt the sting that Leonard stood up for everybody, but nobody stood up for Walter. So, when the cast reconvened about a month later to record the very first episode, George and Nichelle were on the set. Now, Doohan and Barrett were both accomplished voice actors, so they were given the jobs of doing all the other voices on the show so that nobody had to pay for guest stars unless it was absolutely imperative that it had to be done. So Jimmy was quoted later in the 50-year mission as saying, "It's kind of fun doing it, because I did 3 characters, and in 10 of them, I did 4. And I always push for that because once you did more than 3, they had to double your pay. Now, strangely enough, though, I never used any accents. I just changed the tone for my voice. Now, as mentioned before, Chekhov was not in the series. They were, however, able to bring in 2 new bridge officers, Lieutenant Rex and Lieutenant Mores, both aliens, both non-humanoids. Koenig was asked to go ahead and write an episode, and he did, The Infinite Vulcan in Season 2. And in doing so, he experienced what was probably the single biggest problem for writing Star Trek in the animated format. Up to this point, Star Trek was a classic 4-act story. You had 52 minutes in which to set up, advance, and conclude your story. On the animated series, you had to do all 3 in 22 minutes. This generally meant no time for secondary subplots and very few background or establishing scenes. The fact that the show had so many classic episodes was a testimony to the quality of the writers that were still writing for Star Trek. In fact, the 4 episodes of the TV series that you see up here on the screen are considered the best out of the 22, and even more so, the first one, Yesteryear, is actually considered by many fans to be one of the very best episodes of Star Trek ever written in any format to date. The author? D.C. Fontana. It also managed to establish a couple of Star Trek firsts. The first appearance of a holodeck, called a rec deck at that particular point. The introduction of Captain April as the first captain of the Enterprise, before Christopher Pike. And a life support belt that generated a force field around crew members so they didn't have to use bulky spacesuits. Now, while that seemed like a neat idea in the cartoons, it was never carried forward in any of the other shows for Star Trek, probably due to the fact that most people would never really buy into that kind of a viable product, because how would a portable force field supply you with oxygen to breathe? And being animated finally meant they didn't have to make all the aliens in human form, with 2 arms, 2 legs, etc. So a great many new aliens were introduced in the series, including the Kzinti, who were already subjects of previously existing novelizations by Larry Niven. However, the pink color of the Kzinti spacesuits brings up a recurring odyssey in Star Trek, the animated series. The color pink shows up everywhere. We have pink uniforms for Klingons. We had pink uniforms for Kzinti. We had pink starships. We had pink aliens. We had pink skies. We had pink trivels. Everything was pink. What was unknown to most of the production staff at that time, Director Sutherland was colorblind. Now, it is important to point out here that Irv Kaplan made the color choices, not Sutherland. But the only man who could have looked at what Kaplan picked and corrected it or suggested something else was, you guessed it, Sutherland. He had no idea that pink was everywhere. Now, over the years, there have been a series of marketing tie-ins to the cartoon, but maybe not as many as you would see for the other Star Trek series. We saw crossovers between the Transformers and the cartoon. We've seen Hallmark Christmas ornaments. You've got the obligatory trading cards. Nestle even did a candy bar. But probably the most unique thing from the animated show is you could purchase honest-to-God cells from Lincoln Enterprises. The acetate sheets, similar to the ones that were used to make the series and had characters drawn on them. Now, one thing I want to call attention to is a lot of people argued about whether Star Trek the Animated Series was canon or not. Was it true Star Trek or was it make-believe Star Trek? But in Star Trek Lower Decks, the characters in a scene from Star Trek the Animated Series actually show up on a crew member's pad in the show. So at that point, the whole canon piece becomes moot. The other thing I'd like to bring up about this is that it earned Star Trek its very first Emmy for the Best Children's Series from 1974 to 1975. Now, the series had been nominated many times prior to that, but it had never won. And this was to be the first in a series of Emmys that would continue to be won over the following decades. The last thing I want to point out is that there was a public service announcement created during the cartoon's original run on behalf of the Keep America Beautiful program. In the mid-1970s, the United States was struggling with an anti-litter campaign, and This Keep America Beautiful program was fairly substantial. It had a big presence on TV, so it was kind of nice that they approached Star Trek and asked them to create this little promo that you see on the screen. Now, this aired not only during Star Trek, but it aired at other times that the Keep America Beautiful program had paid for commercial slots. So that was also something neat that we experienced if we were alive back then to witness it. In the years that passed, many people will tell you that they definitely remember other PSAs. But the fact of the matter is, there were no other PSAs that were made. Now, of course, the quality of what we're seeing here isn't all that great, but that's because it was recorded on VHS. But we're still lucky to have it at all today. Now, as we end this video, Trek World would like to thank our VIP supporters. If you'd like to join those viewers who support us, please visit us at our Patreon site, patreon.trek-world.com, or use the link in the description in this video.